Welcome to the ArmaniTalks podcast. I'm your host, ArmaniTalks. In this podcast, I'm helping you level up your 5 soft skills: public speaking, storytelling, social dynamics, emotional intelligence, and creativity. 5 soft skills for you to change your life forever, skyrocket your confidence along the way. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about the difference between cheap and frugal. Normally, the word frugal, it doesn't really have a negative connotation to it. It's more practical. You could say wise. This person is not going to unnecessarily spend money for no reason, right? But cheap, that's different. That does have a negative connotation. If someone calls you cheap, you feel disrespected, right? Now, the thing is, how do we spot the difference between when someone is frugal and when someone is cheap? Have you ever heard of the quote, "Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder"? I have a remix to that quote. The remix is, who is cheap and who is frugal is in the eyes of the beholder. And I want you to try this exercise out for yourself. I want you to find something that you are very laid back on, okay? And I want you to find someone who is very picky on the thing that you are laid back on. For example, me and food, we have a very laid back relationship. I'm one of those guys that could eat at Taco Bell, McDonald's, Chipotle, whatever. It's not a big deal for me. But one of my buddies, he is very picky when it comes to food. He will only eat at established places. And due to this, me and him have a disconnect. We used to chill all the time. But nowadays, anytime we're trying to decide where to go eat, we start to get into some arguments. He wants to go to these places where you spend $50 for this tiny little meal that doesn't even fill you up. Why the hell am I going to do that for? Why not just go to Chipotle and get a bowl for $11? So as we're bickering back and forth, he eventually says, "Armani, you are cheap." And I feel offended. What? You're calling me cheap? I'm not cheap. You are lavish. So there's the perception that both of us are having. Different perceptions, of course. From his perspective, he thinks I'm cheap and he thinks he's reasonable. But from my perspective, I am frugal and he is lavish. I got my revenge on this guy though, because when it comes to suits, I don't play. I've had that whole period where I was buying off-the-rack suits and trying to get them tailored, but it wasn't really my thing. Nowadays, when it comes down to suits, I will easily shell out $1,000 for a custom-fit suit. The food snob, though, the food snob is doing the off-the-rack and tailor strategy. So whenever me and him are interacting, and I'm trying to convince him to buy a suit that he could hold on to forever, spend $1,000, homie. He's like, no, Armani, it's just not worth it. It's not worth it? Are you really that cheap? But from his perspective, he thinks he's being frugal. That's why I think when we're calling someone cheap or frugal, we need to understand what sort of preference that they're operating with. For me, food is just food. It's just fuel for me. And if I could get it for less, why spend more? Especially, why would I spend more if I'm getting less? It doesn't logically make sense to me. So whenever I'm being cheap with food, it's not really me being cheap. It's me being frugal. While with this other guy, he's like, why am I going to spend $1,000 on a suit for? Me spending $90 for the off-the-rack suit and $50 for me getting it tailored is more than enough. He thinks he's being frugal. Try this exercise out for yourself. Find something that you are very picky on and find something that someone else is very laid back on. Or you could just do the vice versa. You find something that you are laid back on, they are picky with. You get the general theme. And from there, you guys have to interact. Who is going to get their way? Are you someone who is like, you know what? In vacations, I don't really care where I sleep. I could sleep at a motel. I could sleep at a friend's basement. I don't really care. I'm just going to sleep there, and rest of the trip, I'm going to be traveling. you're laid back on it, but your spouse, she's like, no, it's 4-star hotel or bust. Who gets their way? With this exercise, you will realize that the whole concept of frugal and cheap and labeling it is not that easy. Rather, it's very difficult. Thank you very much for joining the ArmaniTalks podcast, and I'll catch you next time.